Hey everyone, and welcome back. Sometimes you come across a question that just makes you stop and go, hmm, is there something to that? And that's what we're doing today. We're taking on your question about a possible link between autism and eczema, and, well, we're really going to dive deep.
Yeah, and it's a question we're seeing more and more, especially with eczema being so common. And it's way more than just dry skin, right?
Exactly. It's like this persistent itch that just won't let up. And for some folks, it's a daily battle,
Yeah.
affecting everything from getting a good night's sleep to just feeling comfortable in their own skin.
You got it. Now, here's the thing. Studies are pointing to eczema showing up a lot more frequently in people who are autistic than in the general population. We're talking a pretty big difference here.
That's really what got me thinking about this whole thing. So how much more often are we talking? Hit us with the numbers.
All right, so picture this. Roughly 1 in 10 people in the general population have to deal with eczema. But when we look at autistic children, that number jumps up to something like 20 to 30%. That's almost triple. So naturally, it makes you wonder what could be behind that.
Yeah, that's definitely not just a random coincidence. That's a pretty strong sign there's something else going on. And our sources kind of hinted at a few possible explanations, didn't they?
They did. One of the big ones that comes up again and again in the research is this idea of shared genetic factors.
So are we saying there might be certain genes that increase the likelihood of having both autism and eczema?
That's exactly it. You can think of genes like a blueprint. They influence so much how our brains develop, how our bodies react to things around us, and even the way our immune systems work.
That's a perfect segue into the next thing I wanted to ask about. Our sources mentioned something about differences in immune functioning for people with autism. What's the link to eczema there?
It all boils down to inflammation, really. At its core, eczema is a chronic inflammatory condition, and we're finding that a lot of autistic individuals, their immune systems tend to react a little differently.
So you're saying their immune systems might be more likely to have that kind of overreaction that ends up causing inflammation.
Bingo. And that can show up as eczema or make existing eczema even worse. Now, we're still unraveling exactly how all the pieces fit together, but the immune system definitely seems to be a key player in this whole connection.
That makes a lot of sense. And here's another piece of the puzzle. We know that sensory sensitivities are often heightened in people with autism. So how does that factor into all of this?
Just imagine experiencing the world with the volume turned up on everything. Lights seem brighter, sounds are louder, even just the feeling of clothes on your skin can be really intense.
Oh, I get that. I'm pretty particular about certain fabrics myself. Itchy tags, no way.
Right. Now imagine dealing with itchy, inflamed skin on top of that. Even a mild case of eczema can be so much more uncomfortable and distracting for someone with sensory sensitivities.
It's like everything's amplified. That would make things incredibly tough, especially for kids who might not have the words to explain why they're constantly scratching.
Absolutely. And that constant discomfort, that urge to scratch, it can really take a toll, not just on the child either, but on their families as well.
Yeah.
It's something we often don't think about, that ripple effect these conditions can have.
It's not just about the physical symptoms, is it? It's the emotional and social impact, too, especially when you combine autism and eczema. And speaking of impact, our sources really highlighted how challenging this can be, especially for families.
It's a lot, yeah. And there are a lot of families out there who know exactly what that's like. There was even a study, where they found that parents of kids with both autism and eczema, their stress levels were through the roof. And it makes sense, right? Trying to juggle both those things and give your kid the best support possible, it's got to be tough.
It's a testament to how much parents do. Sounds like a constant balancing act. But I'm thinking about our listeners right now. They're probably wanting to hear about what they can do, what can actually be done. So we've covered the potential link, the challenges, but where do we go from here? Are there things that can really make a difference?
That's the good news. There are. And it all starts, like it so often does, with talking to a professional.
Okay, but we're not talking about just any doctor.
Right. You really want someone who understands both autism and eczema, someone who gets how complex it can be. They can put together a treatment plan that tackles those physical symptoms but doesn't forget about sensory sensitivities either. So that might mean finding a dermatologist who's had experience working with autistic kids, or maybe reaching out to some autism support groups for recommendations.
Finding that right fit is so important.
Absolutely, because let's face it, what works for one person might not work for another. And this is where being open with your healthcare provider is key. Don't be afraid to advocate for yourself or your child. Ask questions. Do your research, and if something doesn't feel right or if a treatment isn't working out, speak up.
I love that you emphasize speaking up for yourself. Information is power, right? The more you know, the better equipped you are to handle these kinds of things.
100%. And while we're on the topic of solutions, I got to stress this. Addressing those sensory triggers can make a world of difference.
Like we're connecting the dots between what we know about autism and what we know about eczema. What kind of things are we talking about? What are some sensory triggers people might not even realize are making things worse?
Well, let's start with the obvious. Fabrics. Think about it. For someone with sensory sensitivities, scratchy seams, those itchy tags you mentioned, that can be pure torture. Choosing softer, breathable fabrics like cotton or bamboo can make a huge difference.
And what about things like laundry detergent? Those can be a big trigger for some, right?
Oh, for sure. Fragrances, another big one. They're everywhere. But for someone with sensory sensitivities, those strong smells can be overwhelming, even trigger their skin. So switching to hypoallergenic, fragrance-free laundry detergents, soaps, lotions, that can really cut down on those sensory overload moments.
It's crazy how much we don't even think about with these everyday products.
It really is. And this is where being a bit of a detective comes in handy. Pay attention to those potential triggers, even the less obvious ones, and try to figure out what works best for you or your child.
It's all about those little tweaks, those adjustments that can actually have a big impact on someone's overall well-being. And it goes beyond just the products we're using, doesn't it? It's also about making the home environment more sensory-friendly as well.
Exactly. Think about the lighting, how much noise there is, even the temperature. Creating a space that's calm and soothing can go a long way in reducing stress. And as we know, stress can make eczema flare up.
It all goes back to that mind-body connection. And speaking of support, we talked about getting professional help. But what about emotional support? This can be a lot to handle for both the person going through it and their families. So what are some resources that are out there? Having a good support system can make all the difference in the world. What are some things families can do to kind of build that network of support?
Well, the first thing to remember, and it's so important, is you are not alone in this. There are so many families out there going through these same challenges, and connecting with them can be, honestly, it can be a game changer. There are some great resources out there, online forums, support groups, even just connecting through social media.
Yeah, it's so important to be able to share experiences, find those little tips and tricks that work, and just know that someone else out there gets it.
Absolutely. Those connections, they can really make all the difference. And it's not just for the kids, you know. Parents need support too. Taking care of a child with autism and eczema, it's demanding. It really is. And having that space to talk about the tough stuff, to celebrate the victories, even just to vent when you need to, it can be huge.
It really does take a village sometimes.
Yes.
And sometimes you just need that village to remind you you're doing okay.
You really are. And don't forget about professional support too. Therapy can be so beneficial for kids with autism and eczema, you know, to help them develop those coping skills for sensory overload, emotional regulation.
That makes a lot of sense because it's not just about managing the physical symptoms, it's that emotional and social piece too.
Exactly. And finding a therapist who understands both conditions and can really create that safe, supportive space, that's crucial.
It's about giving these kids and their families the tools they need to really thrive. So as we start to wrap things up here, I want to bring it back to our listeners. What are some key takeaways? What do we hope they walk away from this with?
You know, if there's one thing I want to emphasize, it's this. If you or someone you know is dealing with both autism and eczema, you are not alone. These conditions, they often go hand in hand. And understanding that connection, that's the first step towards finding solutions that really work.
It's about recognizing that it's not just one thing, it's this complex web of factors. And when you have that knowledge, you can start advocating for yourself, for your loved one, finding the right support, and making those small but important changes in your lives.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Don't hesitate to reach out for help. Talk to those healthcare professionals, find those support groups, connect with other families, and just remember every step you take towards understanding and managing these conditions is a step in the right direction.
I love that. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. A huge thank you to our expert for sharing such incredible insights with us today. We really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, really.
And to our listeners, as always, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery. Keep those questions coming because that's what the deep dive is all about. Until next time, everyone.